I'm going to use for this dish soap is make up a solution that I'm going to use as a water replacement. Now it's going to contain water, but it contains 2 extra additives. Now I'm not unique in using these additives, and I'm sure if you have a look around you'll find other people that use them, but I find these just make your dish soap work really well. And the first of those things is these funny old soap nuts. Now you might have heard or seen of soap nuts, and they are literally like a nut, almost so like a conker. They're a natural product, and they actually produce a soapy substance. Now some people do just take these and put them in a little bag and wash with them. I must admit I've never gone that far with actually doing my, clothes washing with them. So I'm not going to give out any advice on how you use them and that sort of thing. It's not the way that I actually use them. But that's what they are, funny little old things. But what we want to do is we want to extract some of the soapiness out of them. So what I do is I start off and I make myself, just like you do an infusion with maybe paprika or a netto or something like that, I make myself a little soap nut infusion. Now, it doesn't really matter how strong or how weak you do it, but I tend to find that if I take my soap nuts, I put about 20 grams of soap nuts in here. And again, let's not get too fussy about this. Some people get really het up about the exact amounts that you use. Remember, when you're doing an extract, how much gets extracted will depend on how much is in the natural product, how long you let it seep for, how hot your water is, how well you squeeze it afterwards. So if you end up with 25 grams or 19 grams or whatever, then great. Let's try chopping a soap nut in half or something to get the exact measurement. Okay, so for that, for the water I'm going to use in this recipe, I'm going to have 240 grams of boiling water. So I've just boiled this water up and I'm just going to add the 240 grams. So what I've done with this is I put in slightly more water than I needed and made sure I brought it to a boil, and then I've just weighed it to make sure I've got enough of that. And what that will do is that will start to extract the soapiness out of those nuts. Now the other thing we want to add is our citric acid. Now, citric acid is a chelator or a chelator. Some people say it both ways. And what it does is it helps your soap bubble and clean and foam more, especially when you've got hard water. And it does that by binding with some of the metals that would be in your water. So it's a great thing to use for a dish soap. So I'm going to add that to this really hot water. Now, again, citric acid is something that you've probably seen people use in other soaps. The key thing is that if you're going to add it in and make your lye solution with the citric acid, you need to make sure that that citric acid is dissolved in water first before you add your lye. Don't try and make it up with your lye solution, because like sugar, it will go all clumpy and horrible and hard. Okay, so I'm going to now just give that a stir and make sure that citric is melted. Or dissolved. It's not really going to melt, is it? If I've got a few little lumps and that of the citric in there, then I might just quickly pop that back in the microwave and just warm that through just a bit, just to 100% make sure that it's dissolved. But it does pretty well look like it's there. Sorry about the barky dog next door. You're probably used to him by now. Right. So that, what I'm going to do now is seal it up, just so, because it's still a bit steamy and I've measured that water, I don't want to lose too much more. Seal that up, and I'm just going to let that cool and then put it in the fridge and get it down to a nice cool temperature before I turn it into my lye solution. We're now at the next stage, and what I've done is I've had this solution that I made. Remember, this had my soap nuts in it, my distilled water and my citric acid. I've had that in the fridge all night, so that's nice and cold. So now I'm going to make up my lye solution. Now the amount of water that I've got in here is pretty well the lowest you can go. I'm doing a 50-50, so I'm going to have as much water as I am lye. And the reason for that is because this is a soap I just really want to, set up really quickly. It's one of those soaps that you can actually use pretty quickly. You know, it doesn't have to go through a full 6-week cure or anything, because there's such little amount of water in it. And I know people talk about curing and how it changes the quality of the soap and whatever. This is just a coconut oil soap that we're using as a dish soap. So those things aren't that necessary. So I find literally, I've even, when I've got a bit short and I've got a bit slow at making this, I've even just used one within a few days and it still works brilliantly. And the rest of them just sit on the side and wait till it's their turn. But certainly you can use it pretty quickly. If you want to leave it to do a full cure, then that's absolutely fine. Right, let's get this made up just like a normal lye solution. One of the things to be careful of is that, remember, this has got additives in it. This has got soap nuts in, so soapy stuff, and it's also got citric in it. And so therefore you need to be careful adding your lye, because it will bubble up potentially and could overflow. So have a nice big jug for it. Okay, so I'm just going to gently put mine in a little bit at a time, just so I don't get any violent reaction with it. And while I'm mixing this in, let's just talk about the amount of lye as well. Because this is a dish soap, you don't want to add any oil to your washing up water. You know, you want to get rid of grease off of your dishes and everything. So therefore, what we want to do with this is we want to make sure that we don't have any superfat in our soap. So therefore, this is done to actually make this soap a 0% superfat. Now, I must admit, I do, and probably really shouldn't even say this, I do tend to actually go a little bit beyond mine and make mine very slightly negative. It's not something that I advise you to do, especially if you're a bit nervous about that sort of thing. My basis for doing that is that even though we talk about lies, you've got to be super accurate. The amount of lye that you put in your soap is actually an estimate. If you ever look at oils, and I'll probably just bring an oil up on the screen here, you can see that the sap value, the saponification value, will always have a range. It's an estimate. An oil is actually a natural ingredient, and depending on the harvest, depending on the crop, the rain and all whatever, it will actually, each time you have an oil, it will actually have slightly different qualities in it and slightly different amounts of fatty acid in it than maybe a different batch. And this is sometimes why, if you've ever used 2 different soap calculators, you may find that the amount of lye you're told to use from one soap calculator is different to the amount from another. Now, it shouldn't be a massive difference, but there will be slight differences. And that's again because of these estimations that are used. And as you can see, sap values have a range where they expect the normal will fall somewhere between that range. So I know we all get very hung up about lye has to be super accurate. And yes, I'm not saying you don't have to be accurate with your lye. Of course you do. But, you know, be aware that you are working off a estimate with a small margin for error. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I do actually increase my lye a tiny bit just to make sure I'm definitely getting rid of any of that superfat that could still be around from a more generous estimate. But as I said, I would literally advise you to do 0% superfat through your lye calculator just to keep everything nice and safe for you. If you do find you end up with a little bit of an oily residue on the top of your water when you use your soap, then maybe next time you do it, add a little bit more lye. The other thing to talk about with this lye is the fact that we've added citric acid into this water. I'm going to do a little slot at the end, so if you're interested in learning about citric acid and how it affects your soap and how you use it in your soap, you can stay around for that. If you just want to see me just make this soap and, you know, stop going on, then, you know, you can then go off and watch something else or do whatever you want to before that end bit. But But yeah, the amount of citric acid that we've got in here will actually affect the performance of this lye. And as I said, I'm going to explain that later on in the video after I've actually made the soap, so you can decide whether you want to watch that or not. I'm now going to leave this to cool down because this is really, really hot. And it is really important to do this. This is one of the only soaps I've ever had really where I've actually had sort of a volcanoing effect where I've mixed stuff together a little bit too warm. So definitely I would make sure that you're getting things lovely and cool before you start mixing stuff together. Okay, so I'm going to come back. As you can see, it's steaming away. I'm going to come back when that's cooled down. What I'm going to do in the meantime is I'm going to melt my oils. This is a 100% coconut oil soap. There's nothing else oil-wise in it at all. I am going to add some fragrance to it just because I like my washing up soap to smell nice. But other than that, the oils are literally just coconut oil. Why coconut oil? Coconut oil is the oil that will create the best lather. Okay, it's a really robust oil. It's really cleansing as well. And remember, by cleansing we mean its ability to strip dirt and grease off of a surface. So this is the most cleansing oil. It's the most bubbliest oil. That's why we use coconut oil when we make soap bars, because it can actually withstand the salt. So it's definitely the oil we want to use for our solid dish soap that we're making. So I'm just going to melt this oil down and then I'm going to get both of them quite cool and then we can make our soap up. I've got everything nice and cool now. So here's my melted coconut oil and my lye soap nut citric solution. And here's my fragrance. I've used an essential oil blend for mine. I've got lemongrass, lemon and peppermint. So that's my essential oils. Right, let's get this mixed up. So it's obviously a very simple soap to put together. But again, we just need to watch because it can, if you're not careful, if you start mixing stuff together when it's a bit too warm, you know, then you can have issues with volcanoing and it getting really thick too quickly. So I've got everything pretty way down to sort of high 80s mine are. About sort of 88, 87, 88 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so it's just a case of blending this up nice and easy. Okay, I'm happy now that I've got that to a really light trace. So I'm going to bring in my essential oil blend. And I'm just going to give that a little blend in. Okay, and I'm happy with that. You don't get too panicky about this. I know I've talked about overheating and all that sort of stuff, but you do still need to make sure that you've got this properly blended and you've got it emulsified, and I like to take it to a lightish trace just so I can pour it nicely into my moulds. Now I tend to use cavity moulds for this just because any 100% coconut oil soap, you have to cut it really quickly, and if you miss the point of cutting it sort of after a couple of hours or so, it will just get so brittle, you know, almost like if you have a lye heavy soap, it will just get so brittle that you won't actually be able to cut it. Okay, so cavity moulds, we can just leave them to do their thing and pop them out when they're ready. Again, I've got these little pretty flower ones, but let's face it, any cavity mould would be fine. Yeah, and you can see how that's thickening up already. Now I'm actually going to make 2 batches of these at the same time, so I'm just going to do this again. I kind of like doing it in the small amounts, so I will just do this whole process again. I have prepared all my oils and lye and everything, so I've just literally got to blend it up. So I do sort of like, don't know for any real reason why, just doing it in the 2 small bits. So what will happen is I've got this lot done, and then I'll just fill the rest of these moulds. I've got another one of these, and that will just fill those all up. Okay, so that is now all starting to set up nicely. And one thing I would advise with these is I like to put mine in the fridge so they don't start to get too hot and crack or anything. So I'm just going to pop these in the fridge, and then I'm going to leave those, and then we'll have a look at them when they're unmoulded. Here are our soaps, literally just under 2 hours later, and they're ready to unmould. They don't need to be unmoulded. I just thought I'd come back in and just show you how quickly we do have to, or we can unmould them if we want. Now, remember I said to you about these not needing a full cure? I wouldn't consider using these yet. Remember, they still need to go fully through saponification. So at the moment, they're only a couple of hours old, so they're not fully saponified. So I wouldn't think about using these for at least a few days. And ideally, you do want to let them cure a bit, just from the point of view of them being a longer lasting, you know, nice hard bar of soap. But they're pretty hard now. Now, these a little bit scruffy on the back. This is not something I sell at all. This is just purely for personal use. Here in the UK, as I'm sure you know if you've watched my videos in the past, we have a lot of tight regulations about what we have to do before we can sell cosmetics, i.e. soap. However, dish soap, which is deemed to be a detergent, not a cosmetic, has even stricter rules, and there's lots of testing and everything that we have to go through. So there's no way I would ever even dream of going down that route of the detergents production and that sort of thing. So this little bit scruffy at the back, that's fine. I'm not selling them. They're just purely for personal use. If I was going to sell them, I'd make sure, like these ones, I would pour them when they're a bit more fluid and all nice and flat. Okay, so should we get these unmoulded? So they should be straightforward, nice little flower moulds. And as you can see, literally just a couple of hours in. And they're really pretty, aren't they? I mean, you could just do, I quite like them in the pretty moulds. I used to just do them in just, you know, the little square blocks, which are perfectly fine as well. But hey, a little bit of flower power and sunshine into your life while you're doing your washing up. Okay, so they do unmould beautifully, nice and easily. You could do them in a loaf mould, and I certainly, again, used to do mine in a loaf mould, just nice and easily pop it in the loaf mould. But you've got to be careful that you get them cut in time, because these pretty brittle already. You know, if you left these in a loaf mould, you need to keep a real eye on it and get it cut as soon as it's basically holding itself together. Let's just do these last ones, shall we? So this will keep me going for a good while with these ones. There we are. Could you colour them? Yes, you can. I have seen people make dish soaps in different colours. I personally don't like to do that, because to me, I want to have the stuff going into my washing up water as clean as possible. So I don't want to add any colourants, but certainly you could if you wanted to do a tiny little bit of colour. To be honest, I've never done it myself, so I don't want to advise, you know, whether you'd use the water soluble colourants or anything like that. I kind of like them just like this. And can you see, even though that solution, the lye solution, was dark, and when we actually blended the soap it was really quite dark, can you see as it's actually set up, it's a really lovely creamy colour. So let's have a look at why you might want to put citric acid in your soap. Citric acid can actually help us solve the problems caused by hard water. Now, there's two main things that we have going on when we've got some hard water. The first of those is you might find that a lather is very difficult to achieve with your soap, so therefore no lovely lather and no lovely bubbles. The second problem comes from soap scum. Now, soap itself doesn't actually cause soap scum. Let's go inside our bath a little bit and have a look at this soap scum and see what it's caused by. Soap scum is a combination of calcium stearate and magnesium stearate. And the problem with that is it's not very soluble, so it doesn't dissolve nicely, and therefore it stops your soap lathering, and also it leaves that nasty residue around your bath or any surfaces that you're using your soap in. Now, as I've already said, soap itself doesn't cause soap scum. You need to have a combination of things. Our soap contains a lot of sodium stearate. It's one of the most common fatty acids that we have in our soap. And when you've got hard water contains extra minerals and ions. And the more minerals and ions that it's got, the harder that water is. And those are typically things like calcium and magnesium. So when we get the combination of our hard water, that calcium and magnesium from the hard water, combining with our soap, that sodium stearate, we get this calcium stearate and magnesium stearate. And that's where our soap scum comes from. So now we know how we get soap scum. How does citric acid stop it from happening? Citric acid on its own isn't going to help. So my little image at the start of me just sprinkling citric acid into the bath isn't going to help you out. What we need to do is we need to turn citric acid into this chelator or chelator, whichever way we're supposed to say it. And the chelator that we want to have is sodium citrate. Now you may hear the phrase sodium citrate and think, sodium sounds soapy. Sodium citrate comes from combining our citric acid with sodium hydroxide. And we know sodium hydroxide is lye. It's the lye we use to make our solid bar soap. And that gives us sodium citrate. Now, the ions and molecules in our chelator are friendly little things, and they love to bond with metal ions that are in the water. So what happens is when the chelator in your soap mixes with the water, those ions and molecules in your chelator go and grab those metals out of the water and stop them combining with that stearate. So therefore they effectively cage them up and stop the soap scum forming. So the last thing I want to have a look at is how putting citric acid in your soap affects your soap recipe. We need to consider our pH scale. Now, going back to your science days in school or whatever, you remember that we have a scale that measures how acid or alkaline any substance is. For something to get a reading of 0, it must be very acidic. So that would be things like battery acid. Our citric acid, not quite so acidic, so that will plop in about here. Now, our alkaline items will range up to 13, 14, and the alkaline that we use in our soap, sodium hydroxide, is extremely alkaline. So that goes right at the end of the alkaline scale. When we look at a neutral pH, we're typically looking at a range of 7, and the most common thing we find at that level is pure water. So let's now consider some other things that are useful to us as a soap maker. What about our skin? The pH of our skin does vary depending on the type of person and the area of the body. But if we pop skin around about 5.5, that would be about right. So our skin, as you can see, is slightly acidic. And when we make our soap, because our soap is a combination of sodium hydroxide for our solid soap, which we know has changed into soap, so there's none of that sodium hydroxide left. Overall, we would typically find a bar of soap is in the range of 9.5 to 10.5. So as you can see, our soap is still alkaline. Now, one of the other things you may remember is that you can change the pH reading of a substance by adding something else to it. So if you had a very acidic substance, if you added something more alkaline to it, you would take it more towards the neutral range. And depending on how much of those substances had would decide on how much of an effect that would have. Now, this leads us to two issues with soap making. The first is when we add citric acid, it has an effect on our lye and how much lye we have to use in our soap. And the second one is a really common misconception that a lot of people seem to think that by adding citric acid to their soap, they actually make their soap milder. They take the view that soap is an alkaline substance, so if I bung a load of citric acid in it, what I'll do is I'll neutralise the soap and bring it more towards the same pH as our skin. And therefore that would give us this magical soap that is beautiful and completely in balance with our skin. That's not the case. If you see people talking about that for bar soap, then it's not the case. It's not going to happen. And I'll explain why in a minute. We typically use citric acid at a rate of between 1 and 2% of oils, depending on how hard your water is. We know the goal of adding our citric acid to our soap is to create that chelator, that sodium citrate. And we do that by adding it to our lye. Now you want to dissolve your citric acid in your water first before your lye is added, otherwise it will go crunchy and hard and you'll just have a really exfoliating soap that won't be very pleasant to use. So dissolve it in your water and then add your lye to your water as normal. As we just spoke about, when you add an acid to an alkali, they will have a neutralising effect. So the citric acid actually neutralises some of the alkali in the lye. It reduces the lye's power. So when you think about it, you've been very careful with your recipe to choose the right amount of lye to turn your oils into soap and potentially give you a superfat, something like 5% or something. So when you add citric acid, what it's doing is it's reducing how much lye is actually available for the saponification process. Now, there's a couple of things you can do about this. You can either just ignore it. If you ignore it, obviously the reduction in the lye will create a greater amount of superfat in your soap. If you want to stay with the superfat that you like, then you're going to need to add more lye in to compensate for the lye that was lost because it was used up by the citric acid. We saw earlier that lye, sodium hydroxide, is a much stronger alkali than citric acid is as an acid. So therefore it's not a straightforward 1-to-1 ratio. For example, if you put 10 grams of citric acid in your soap, it's not going to neutralise 10 grams of lye because it's not as powerful as the sodium hydroxide. So when you're using sodium hydroxide, you will find that 1 gram of citric acid uses up 0.6 grams of lye, your sodium hydroxide. If you're dealing with liquid soap and potassium hydroxide, the rates are slightly different, but I'm not dealing with liquid soap in this video. Therefore, to preserve our superfat, how we wanted it in the first place, we need to work out how much more lye we want to put in. So let's just do a simple calculation. I'm just going to pop in some random figures. Let's pretend that we've got a soap that we're making with 1000 grams of oil. If we've decided we've got very hard water and we want to use 2% citric acid, that means we're going to put 20 grams of citric acid into our recipe. So let's have a look at the effect of that on the lye. 20 grams times 0.6 gives us 12 grams. So therefore, by putting in 20 grams of citric acid, we're actually removing or using up 12 grams of lye, which won't be available to saponify your soap. Therefore, you would need to add an extra 12 grams of lye into your recipe to keep everything the same how it was before. And then lastly, let's finish off by looking at why adding citric acid to our soap recipe doesn't change the pH. Well, it just literally stems from what we've just talked about. Remember, when we put the citric acid in the soap, we're turning some lye into sodium citrate. So every time we use citric acid, it's used up by the lye and it reduces some lye. There's no citric acid left in the soap. You're not going to end up with this weird miracle formula that's got a lower pH. Every time you put more citric acid in, you reduce the amount of lye. And if you don't compensate for that, if you don't put more lye in, what you're going to end up is with less soap, because you're going to have lye being used up by the citric acid and not available to complete the saponification process. The more you do that, the more superfat that you're going to have. If you keep doing it, you're going to end up with a really sludgy bar of soap with a huge big superfat and quite a crystalline sort of chemically debris feeling on it as well. Okay, the citric acid won't stay in the soap, it reduces the lye. So every time you use it, you are reducing the lye. The rest of the lye creates soap, and that soap is still soap. It's still that soap at that pH of 9.5 to 10.5. You cannot reduce the pH of your soap. You might think, well, why don't I add my citric acid after the saponification stage? You can't do that with bar soap, because when you think about it, the saponification stage is at the point where your bar soap has set up and gone hard. You can't at that point go back in and add citric acid afterwards. That's where I'm going to leave this discussion for now. I hope you've found it useful. I tried not to make it too geeky and sciencey, but I did think it was important to try and explain where everything was coming in a slightly scientific way. So I do hope you found it useful. If you like this video, it would be great if you gave me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see what I'm making in the future, why not subscribe to my channel? Thanks for watching, everyone. Happy soaping!